A single warning inside a guarded hall suddenly makes seasoned ministers feel as if the ground beneath decades of diplomacy has started to crack. What was meant to be a routine regional summit turns in seconds into a moment that forces powerful states to reconsider assumptions they trusted for years. Why are analysts quietly asking whether Ibrahim Traore has recognized a pattern others dismissed, and whether that realization changes the stakes for everyone watching? Because what followed that question did not calm the room, it deepened the sense that history had just shifted direction. You are about to hear something most public briefings never state directly, not because it is hidden, but because it forces listeners to rethink how power actually operates behind formal agreements. You will gain a clearer lens on real geopolitical leverage. This is not casual listening. Ignore this moment and the situation may look like another dramatic speech in a tense region. Yet those who stop at that surface often walk away with a distorted reading of how influence, security, and sovereignty truly interact. Narratives feel simple, comforting, and misleading. That gap is where misjudgments begin. And misjudgments at this level rarely stay local. They spread across borders, policies, and alliances. Missing what is unfolding here does not just mean missing information. It can mean misunderstanding the direction events are already moving. What observers first assumed was actually a strategic signal, and within roughly 10 minutes of Ibrahim Traore beginning his address, the tone inside the hall had shifted from protocol to alert attention. One figure matters here. For more than a decade, thousands of foreign troops with advanced surveillance technology operated across parts of the Sahel. Yet insurgent groups still expanded, a contrast that quietly unsettled even supportive officials. TRUOCHET, the roots trace back to a single tension point. External security structures promised stability but delivered only partial containment. That partial containment produced a cycle in which violence never fully disappeared yet never triggered decisive change, creating what analysts describe as managed fragility. Kung Luke, communities closest to conflict zones were the first to feel the contradiction, watching heavily equipped convoys pass while local insecurity persisted. The issue escalated because perception and reality diverged. Official records spoke of cooperation, funding, and joint missions. Field experience spoke of burned villages and shrinking opportunity. Hangzhou, while one rural account described elders tracking the frequency of armed attacks rather than rainfall because it had become the more reliable predictor of harvest loss. That small shift revealed something larger when security statistics and lived experience diverge. Trust erodes faster than infrastructure can be rebuilt. Ibrahim Traore framed this gap not as coincidence but as structure, suggesting the region was maintained in a state strong enough to function yet weak enough to depend. The claim resonated because it aligned with what many had quietly noticed but rarely articulated publicly. Skeptics initially treated the warning as political theater, yet the room's reaction suggested something else was happening. Faces remained composed, but posture changed, pens paused, and translators slowed their typing. At that moment, the speech stopped sounding like commentary and started sounding like diagnosis. The implication was subtle yet heavy. If the pattern described was real, then the current system was not failing accidentally. It was performing exactly as designed. Trained observers in the chamber did not rely on headlines to judge moments like this. One regional security analyst present, known for advising multiple West African mediation panels, watched the exchange with the calm focus of someone accustomed to separating symbolism from substance. His credibility did not come from titles alone, but from years spent moving between negotiation rooms and frontline provinces, comparing what leaders promised with what communities experienced. That dual vantage point made his reactions more revealing than any official statement. He later described a detail that most attendees missed. When the address shifted from broad warnings to specific mechanisms of influence, several delegates who had been taking notes stopped writing at the same time. Yet to him, it signaled recognition rather than confusion. He had seen the same pause once before during a crisis briefing years earlier, just before a regional coalition changed its entire security doctrine. A second incident reinforced his impression that this was not an isolated reaction. In another section of the hall, a translation officer quietly removed his headset, not because he could not follow the words, but because he suddenly did not need translation to grasp the implication. Moments like that rarely appear in official records, yet professionals trained to read runes treat them as data points as meaningful as statistics. From his perspective, the significance was straightforward. The speech was not merely being heard, it was being processed as actionable analysis. And when experienced officials begin evaluating a speech as analysis, they are no longer listening ceremonial. From that moment, the situation was no longer simple. Before that day, the narrative moved slowly. After that day, it accelerated. First, a statement landed. Short, direct, unadorned. Ibrahim Traoré questioned the premise that external protection automatically meant internal safety. The room stiffened, delegates shifted. Advisors leaned closer to their screens. Then reactions began. Quiet at first. A note passed, a message sent, a call scheduled. No announcement yet, but movement everywhere. Within hours, analysts circulated summaries. Some flagged the warning, others flagged the implications, a few flagged the timing, because timing mattered. The region was already tense. Security incidents had risen, public patience had thinned. Momentum built. Reports appeared, commentaries followed, panels convened. Each added pressure. Each added interpretation. Each added urgency. Soon the responses multiplied. Regional officials defended existing frameworks. Critics questioned them. Supporters invoked sovereignty. Opponents warned of instability. Statements stacked on statements. Language sharpened. Then escalation. Headlines intensified. Diplomats requested clarifications. Observers requested data. Investors requested risk assessments. Every sector began measuring exposure. Information spread faster than verification. Rumors surfaced. Corrections followed. New claims replaced old ones. Consequences surfaced next. Rural communities asked where the change was coming. Urban professionals asked whether markets would react. No group stayed untouched. The aftershock phase settled in, not silence. Conversations slowed but deepened. Instead of asking what was said, insiders began asking what it meant long-term. That question carried more gravity than any immediate reaction. Because once a narrative forces institutions to reassess their assumptions, reversal becomes difficult. Systems can ignore criticism, they cannot easily ignore doubt. And doubt, once introduced at the structural level, rarely fades quickly. Numbers change the tone of any debate. They replace impressions with scale. They force attention. First, consider a baseline. For more than a decade, multiple Sahel zones hosted thousands of foreign soldiers, equipped with satellite surveillance and long-endurance drones. That figure signals operational density across vast territory. It means the region ranked among the most heavily monitored conflict belts on Earth. Next comes the shift. Despite that presence, armed groups multiplied rather than declined over the same period. The contrast indicates strategy produced containment, not resolution. In practical terms, it shows force projection alone did not translate into durable local security. Then comes the human measure. Billions of dollars were recorded as spent on stabilization missions, while clinics in several provincial areas reportedly remained empty and some schools closed. That gap reveals resource flow did not equal lived improvement. It suggests investment scale and civilian outcome moved on separate tracks. While all the pattern Ibrahim Traoré highlighted was not framed as a sudden failure, but as a long curve visible only when years are compared side by side. When seen that way, the issue stops looking like a temporary setback and starts resembling a structural design. Observers who map timelines instead of headlines notice the same trend: announcements peaked early. Progress plateaued later, expectations declined quietly. NUOC defenders of existing frameworks argue that preventing total collapse is itself a measurable success. That claim carries weight because without intervention some regions might indeed have fallen faster. Yet the counterpoint remains equally concrete. Stabilization that never transitions into self-sustaining security risks becoming permanent dependency. Analysts began aligning these figures with policy decisions. Once numbers and timelines overlapped, a heavier conclusion emerged. The situation was not defined only by conflict. It was defined by trajectory. And trajectories, unlike events, reveal where systems are actually heading. Some analysts see the situation one way. Others see it differently. Both deserve to be heard before any conclusion is drawn. One strong opposing view argues that external military partnerships, despite imperfections, prevented the Sahel from collapsing into wider regional war. Supporters of this position point to the fact that multinational missions brought surveillance capacity, logistics networks, and rapid response coordination that local forces alone might have struggled to assemble quickly. From that angle, the presence of foreign troops was not a mechanism of control, but a stabilizing buffer that bought time for governments to rebuild institutions. Yet when this claim is tested against field reports describing persistent insecurity in certain provinces, a gap appears between strategic capability and everyday protection, suggesting that capacity alone does not guarantee outcome. A second serious critique focuses on rhetoric rather than policy. Skeptics say that when leaders frame global dynamics as systemic exploitation, such language can intensify distrust and reduce space for diplomatic cooperation. They argue that international systems, while flawed, still provide aid, trade access, and security coordination that smaller economies rely on. This perspective matters because global interdependence is real, and abrupt disengagement can produce shocks of its own. However, supporters of Ibrahim Traoré's stance counter that dependency without leverage is not partnership but asymmetry, and they point to long-term trade patterns where raw materials leave regions cheaply while finished goods return at far higher prices. But it does show why the argument resonates locally. Placed side by side, these perspectives clarify something important. It is about which risks societies are willing to tolerate: the risk of dependence or the risk of rupture. At that precise stage, the narrative did not just intensify, it changed direction. Ibrahim Traoré introduced a claim that reframed the entire discussion: the greatest threat might not come from outside actors at all, but from fractures forming within alliances themselves. That single shift redirected attention from visible adversaries to invisible pressures. Listeners who had been focused on borders suddenly began thinking about trust. While all this was not presented as speculation but as a structural warning. He described how modern conflicts often begin quietly through rumors, manipulated information, and engineered suspicion rather than open confrontation. If cohesion fails internally, no external defense can compensate. Analysts recognize the strategic weight of that logic because it transforms the battlefield from geography into perception. The effect was immediate though subtle. Delegates who had been evaluating military capacity began reassessing communication channels. Officials concerned with troop levels started discussing narrative control. That rotation matters because psychological fractures spread faster than logistical ones and are far harder to repair once they deepen. Nothing visible had changed in the road. No declarations were issued, yet the intellectual terrain had shifted. The conversation was no longer about whether pressure existed, it was about where it was most dangerous. And from that moment on, every earlier detail seemed to point somewhere deeper. The consequences did not remain inside conference walls, layer by layer, until they touched institutions, markets, households, and neighboring states. What began as a warning translated into tangible pressure points that different groups experienced in very different ways. At the government level, officials found themselves balancing two clocks at once. One measured public expectations for visible change. The other measured diplomatic reactions from partners evaluating risk. When Ibrahim Traoré's position signaled a shift towards stronger autonomy, policymakers had to reassess agreements, timelines, and alliances almost simultaneously. Even without immediate policy reversals, the mere possibility of strategic realignment forced ministries to prepare contingency scenarios. Because credibility in governance often depends as much on anticipation as on action, businesses felt the shift through uncertainty rather than directives. And when rhetoric suggests structural transformation, capital tends to pause until clarity returns. Supply planners began reviewing contracts. Logistics firms evaluated routes. Financial analysts recalculated exposure. None of these reactions required a formal decree, they were triggered by perception of trajectory. For ordinary citizens, the effect was more psychological yet no less real. And transit stops began to revolve around what might come next. Some people felt cautious optimism, interpreting the message as a promise of dignity and self-determination, aware that transitions often bring turbulence before stability. This emotional duality is common whenever societies sense that a turning point may be approaching but cannot yet see its final shape. Regionally, neighboring states watched closely. Alliances rarely operate in isolation, and when one member signals a doctrinal shift, partners must decide whether to align, adapt, or distance themselves. Ibrahim Traoré's stance therefore functioned as a regional signal, not just a national statement. Diplomats monitored tone. Security officials monitored coordination. The ripple pattern revealed something fundamental. The moment a strategic narrative changes, effects do not wait for formal implementation. They begin spreading immediately through expectation, interpretation, and response. No sector remained untouched. If current trajectories continue without sudden shocks, the most likely path is gradual recalibration rather than dramatic rupture. Testing new alignments while keeping existing channels open to avoid destabilizing trade, security coordination, or financial flows. Ibrahim Traoré's posture would function less like a brake and more like a negotiating lever, increasing bargaining power without forcing immediate confrontation. The region would move through a phase of controlled friction while systems adapt. A more optimistic outcome is also plausible if strategic messaging translates into disciplined policy execution. Clearer economic priorities and consistent communication could reduce uncertainty and attract partners willing to engage on revised terms. Confidence tends to follow predictability, and predictability often follows coherent leadership signals. Should that alignment hold, the shift could produce incremental gains in local industry, governance credibility, and public trust, reinforcing a positive cycle. The worst-case trajectory, however, would emerge if mistrust accelerates faster than coordination. In that situation, misinterpretations could trigger defensive reactions from external actors while internal divisions widen under pressure. And decision-makers might be forced into reactive moves instead of strategic ones. Such outcomes rarely result from a single event, they arise when uncertainty compounds faster than institutions can respond. The crucial insight is not predicting which path will occur, it is recognizing that each path remains open, and that awareness itself shapes choices made today. After seeing the broader landscape, the question becomes personal. What does all this mean for someone watching from afar yet living in a world shaped by these shifts? Large geopolitical movements rarely stay distant. They influence prices, migration patterns, investment climates, and even the narratives people hear daily about stability and risk. Understanding the forces behind them is not abstract knowledge, it is practical awareness. Those who already follow global developments closely hold an advantage. Compare sources and detect patterns before they become headlines. For this group, the task is refinement rather than awakening. Continue tracking credible information, verify claims, and watch how decisions connected to figures like Ibrahim Traoré evolve over time. Early understanding often translates into better judgment when conditions change quickly. Another group experiences effects indirectly. They may not study geopolitics, yet their work, savings, or opportunities still respond to shifts in international dynamics. For them, preparation does not require expertise. Recognizing that distant decisions can shape local realities helps reduce surprise and allows small adjustments before pressures intensify. There is also a third group who feel detached, convinced such developments belong only to diplomats and analysts. But it can also delay awareness. When changes eventually reach daily life, they can appear sudden even if they have been building for years. Simply understanding the outline of events can prevent that shock. Whichever group someone belongs to, awareness creates room to respond rather than react. Solutions cannot remain slogans. Situations shaped by structural forces demand responses that are equally concrete. measurable, and timed, so the real question is not whether change is needed, but how it can actually be carried out in practice. At the leadership level, decision-makers must first define precise priorities and timelines instead of broad declarations. In a context influenced by voices such as Ibrahim Traoré, success would be measured through visible indicators. Agreements revised within set months, domestic production benchmarks reached within defined years, and public reporting that allows citizens to track whether commitments translate into outcomes. Even strong policies fade into rhetoric. For institutions and businesses, the task is execution rather than commentary. Organizations connected to regional economies would need to adjust supply strategies, diversify partnerships, and build resilience buffers before disruptions occur. The most effective actors are usually those who prepare during uncertainty rather than after it. Their progress can be evaluated through stability indicators such as delivery continuity, investment retention, and workforce consistency. At the citizen level, action is smaller but still powerful. Individuals cannot redesign systems, yet they can strengthen collective awareness. That means verifying information before sharing it, supporting initiatives that reinforce local capacity, and staying attentive to policy changes that affect daily life. Success here is measured through observable behavior, reduced spread of false reports, higher civic participation, and more informed public discussion. Regional cooperation can amplify all three layers. Joint frameworks, shared standards, and coordinated communication reduce the risk that misunderstanding turns into escalation. When multiple actors move with aligned timing, friction decreases and predictability increases. Because in the end, implementation, not intention, is what determines whether any strategy truly changes reality. That seasoned analyst in the chamber watched a room full of officials fall briefly silent, the same way he once had during a crisis briefing years earlier. The memory returns now because it marked the first moment he sensed that something deeper than a speech was unfolding. When routine attention shifted into strategic listening. Since that point, the path has carried listeners through warning, reaction, doubt, and reassessment. What began as a single address evolved into a chain of reflections about power, dependence, and the meaning of stability itself. Along the way, familiar assumptions loosened, and questions once considered peripheral moved to the center. The journey has not been about spectacle, it has been about recognition. In that recognition lies the emotional core of the story. It is about communities measuring hope against risk, leaders weighing pressure against principle, and societies deciding whether caution or conviction will guide their next step. The name Ibrahim Traoré has come to symbolize that tension for many observers, not merely as an individual figure, but as a signal of a broader turning point that people sense even if they cannot yet define it. Because this was never just news, it was a mirror. And the reflection is now every owner's responsibility. Understanding changes destiny. Moments like this often leave each observer with a different feeling. Some see caution, others see possibility. Both reactions are natural. Because stories about power, sovereignty, and change rarely produce only one interpretation. What matters is that conversations about them continue with thoughtfulness rather than noise, and with curiosity rather than assumption. If this story feels meaningful to you, it may also matter to someone else who has not yet encountered it. Not through pressure, but through shared reflection. And when more people understand the forces shaping the world around them, discussions become clearer, calmer, and more constructive. So perhaps the most valuable next step is simply this: keep the dialogue alive. Ask what others see, compare perspectives, listen for nuance. The goal is not agreement, it is understanding. Because understanding is what turns information into wisdom, and wisdom is what helps societies navigate uncertain futures together. What do you think is the most important signal to watch next?